So Charles de Gaulle wrote a memoir, and the first sentence in it was, all my life I've had a certain idea about France. And all my life I've had a certain idea about America. I've thought of us as a deeply flawed but fundamentally well-intentioned and good country, and a place that harbors growth. I grew up in New York City, about a half mile from where my great-grandfather had a butcher shop when he immigrated here from Ukraine. And my family stayed in that neighborhood in Lower East Side until the present day, 5 generations in one spot. But we changed as a family as we got more American. When I was 5, my parents were somewhat left-wing, so they took me to what the hippies in the 1960s called a be-in, where they would go to Central Park and they would just be. And one of the things they did was they put a garbage can on fire, and they threw their wallets into it to demonstrate how little they cared about money and material things. And I was 5, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can. So I broke from the crowd, reached into the fire, grabbed the money, and ran away. And that was my first step over to the right. And that began a process of growth. When I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear, and decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer. And I've been writing pretty much every day since then, 7 days a week, except for maybe 200 in the course of my entire life. And so I used to get up, I'd still get up 7 a.m. to 1 p.m., that's my normal writing window. I used to wear a Fitbit, it thought I was sleeping. But I was just doing what I was put on earth to do. And writing became the core of my identity, and my own personal journey of growth. Remember in high school, I wanted to date a woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me, she dated some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. So those were my values. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia University, Brown University, and Wesleyan University decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And if you know anything about Chicago, it's a super cerebral place. The famous saying about it is where fun goes to die. My favorite saying about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so, super cerebral. And I fit right in. I had a double major in history and celibacy while I was in Chicago. We entered my freshman roommate in the Golden Gloves boxing competition. We gave him a nickname, the Kosher Killer, and he'd never boxed a day in his life, but we thought we should prepare for the bout. And so we did it at the University of Chicago. We didn't practice boxing, but we read a lot of books about boxing. And his glorious career lasted 29 seconds. And then I grew a little, and I was hired to be a columnist at the New York Times, or I was hired to be the conservative columnist there, a job I likened to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there, but it was my role. And then I got a job on PBS. And so you would think a job at TV would loosen me up a little, but I got a job in the most cerebral part of TV, which is the news hour. And so we have like 14-minute conversations about fiscal policy, and we have a deeply thoughtful and wonderful audience. They're somewhat seasoned. And so if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your program, but my mother loves it. And so that was part of my process of growth. And then I'm just inspired by what we just heard. I've also grown a little emotionally. I've done 1 million panel discussions. And I was asked by a friend of ours named Oscar Eustace to do a panel discussion at the Public Theater. And most panel discussions I do are on think tanks in Washington, D.C. But the Public Theaters in New York, they produced Hamilton and lots of other stuff. And so we're in the backstage before the panel discussion in this theater, and Anne Hathaway's there, and there's a clown there, a guy named Bill Irwin, I think. And we have a group hug, and we're like, yeah, we're going to do this thing together. And we all charge out onto the stage, and Anne sings a song, and there are tears there, or there are tissues there in case we start crying. And then we do the panel, and we come back, we do another group hug and congratulate each other. It was like so different from the American Enterprise Institute panels on policy. And I thought, I've got to spend more time with theater people, and I've got to grow. And that's what America's about. And I've seen some of the best of America. I covered the end of the Soviet Union for the Wall Street Journal. And I was in Moscow in 1991. And there was a coup to take down what was then the burgeoning democratic government of Russia, led by, I'm not blanking on his name, Boris Yeltsin. And I woke up, looked out the window, tanks were rolling through town. Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank in front of the Russian parliament building and told the Soviets, I dare you to shoot me. And all the Democrat activists came to where Yeltsin was standing, and they wanted to surround him as human shields. And I saw a woman, an old lady, handing out sandwiches. And her name was Valentina Kosieva. And I go up to her and ask her life story, which is what we're paid to do. And she said, well, I'll tell you. I grew up, she was 93 in 1991. She said, I grew up in the palace of the Tsar. And when the Russian Revolution happened, we were all exiled or killed. And I was lined up to be executed when I was a teenager. And my mother begged the firing squad not to shoot me, and they didn't. So she escaped. She married a guy in the 30s. One day he disappeared and was taken off to the Gulag in Siberia, and she never saw him again. In the 1940s, her 2 sons were killed by the Nazis in the Battle of Stalingrad. In the 1950s, she was with her second husband. Their apartment was raided. He was picked up and told he had 20 minutes to leave, and she never saw him again. She was part of the Kalmyk people, which is a Muslim population in Russia. And in the 1950s, she was sent to eternal exile. So every bad event that happened in Soviet history happened to her. And my brilliant journalism technique was just to go, and then what happened? And then what happened? And one of the glories of America is that we were part of a democratic movement that helped end the Soviet Union, which was truly an evil empire. And so that was a force for good. A couple years after that, I'm in southern Africa, Mozambique, Namibia, and I'm watching people die of AIDS. And I go to a village in Mozambique where there are kids and there are grandparents, there are no parents, because they've all died of HIV. I go back there a couple years later after George W. Bush's PEPFAR initiative. And I've never seen a policy so change a place. These people were living. I wasn't watching people die. It was like going to the CVS. People were going to the hospital, getting their ARV drugs, and they were living. And that's because we dedicated some number of billions of dollars to save 25 million lives. And so that, to me, was America at its finest. Now, over the last 2 or 3 months, my idea of America has taken some hits. 2 days in particular stand out in searing memory. The first was the Zelensky meeting in the Oval Office. I've always thought, yeah, we screw up, we're arrogant, we're innocent, we do stupid stuff. But we're rarely ill-intentioned. And what I saw that day was a group of people who occupied the Oval Office seeking power, just pure power, the power to bully. And George Orwell wrote about this. One of his characters in 1984 says, we want power just for its own sake. We have no vision, we just want power. And the character says, how do you know when you have power? Is it when people obey? No, you can't be sure. The only time you can be sure you have power is when other people suffer, when you cause suffering. And I felt I saw that in the Oval Office, a room I've been in many times and interviewed many presidents. And it was a shock to my view of America. The second day was Liberation Day, the day Trump announced the tariffs. And I won't talk to you about economics, but I will talk to you about what I think is also, I've imagined, part of my idea of America, which is that we welcome all sorts of people here. We celebrate diversity and pluralism. And the greatness of our country is that we're a crossroads nation where people come and bring their talents and they have the opportunity to grow. I cover AI. When you go to the AI labs, you know what the hardest thing about writing an AI? It's spelling the names of all the researchers, because they come from Georgia or Ghana or Indonesia. Unusual names for me. And the peak of all civilizational moments is when people come together and create confidence. a national sense of confidence. And when I look at a country now that wants to erect trade barriers, barriers to the movement of people, a general hostility to foreigners, that just doesn't seem like the country that I grew up in New York, or you grew up in here in San Diego, or wherever. It's just not America. And so one of the things that's happened in this country, and not only in this country, is that a cataclysmic loss of confidence and some sort of spiritual assault. If you, Ipsos, this polling organization, asks people, do you think your country's in decline? 58% of Americans think the country's in decline. 60% of Americans agree with the statement the system is broken. 69% of Americans think the elites don't get people like me. 62% believe that experts in this country don't know what they're talking about. 45% think we need a strong man who will break the rules to restore order. This is not just about one election. This is a pervasive sense of who we are as a country and a loss of faith in that. And so how did it come about? Well, some of it are the normal policy answers. Reactions against globalization, policy failures like the financial crisis, Iraq and Afghanistan. But the part that gets me is below all that. First, we've just become sadder as a country. Mental health is rising, mental health problems are rising, suicide is up by 30%, 60% among teenagers. 35% of Americans say they're persistently lonely. 45% of teenagers say they're hopeless and despondent much of the time. The number of Americans who say they have no close friends is up by fourfold since 2000. The number of Americans who are not in a romantic relationship is up by a third since 2000. The number of Americans who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category is up by 50% since 2000. We've just gotten sadder. And when you get sadder, you get meaner. Because if you feel yourself unseen, invisible to those around you, you regard that as a threat, which it is, and indignity, which it is. 2 generations ago, 60% of Americans said, I trust my neighbors, 60%. Now that's down to 30%, and 19% a millennial. My sister-in-law is a nurse at a hospital in New Jersey. She says our main problem is we can't keep staff because the patients have become so abusive. The nurses burn out and want to leave the profession. And so not only sadder, we've gotten meaner as a society. And we've gotten more pessimistic. There's a thing called Google Ngrams where you can measure all the words in circulation in the books, the magazines, and the newspapers. And you can trace this back to 1850. And through most of American history, most of our conversation was positive. Positive words, positive emotions. Around 2010, it collapses. The number of headlines in the media meant to generate fear and anger is up by 200% since 2010. And so we are in the most pessimistic conversation in American history. And one of the problems is we've told a generation of young people that they don't have control over their own lives. The system is so broken, they don't have control of their lives. When you take away people's locus of control, the sense I can control my life, you've taken away a lot. If you ask young people, do you agree with the following statement, young adults? Most people are selfish and out to get you. 72% of Gen Z say, yeah, I agree with that. It's hard for me to imagine going through life thinking that everybody I see is selfish and out to get me. It would just create a lot. It would create this downness, this sadness, this meanness, this distrust. And what do people do when they feel naked and alone? They do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do. They revert to tribe. And what a lot of people do, they find tribe in politics. They ask politics to fill the hole in their soul and the hole in their social life. There's a guy named Ryan Streeter who has a study that people who describe themselves as lonely are 7 times more likely to volunteer in politics. Politics is a seductive form of social therapy. It seems to give you a sense of belonging. You're a member of Team Red or Team Blue. But you're not really in community, you're just hating the same people. Politics seems to give you a sense of righteousness, that I'm on the good guy's side. But you're not sitting with the widow or serving the poor. You're just hating somebody on Twitter. And so politics gives you the illusion that you're going to find what you're spiritually and socially looking for. But it takes you out of isolation and it puts you in a state of cultural and moral war. And we're in that state of war because politics has overcome everything. And so this spiritual and social recession, I think, undergirds our politics. But let me take it a level lower. Why aren't we in a spiritual and social recession? Well, one of my favorite sayings from psychology is from a guy named John Bowlby, an attachment theorist. And he says, all of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. All of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. And my argument is that recent history has robbed people of their secure base. Now, what is a secure base? Fundamentally, of course, it's our attachment to our parents, or to some loving caregiver. Every child needs that. But it's other things. A safe neighborhood, a healthy community, attachment to a nation, and fundamentally and underappreciated, attachment to a sense of moral order, a sense that we are held together as communities by a shared sense of morality. And I hadn't come across that Elon Musk quote, but if you say empathy is a problem, we no longer have a shared moral order. There was a historian named George Marsden who wrote, what gave such wildly compelling force to Martin Luther King's leadership and oratory was his bedrock conviction that moral law was built into the universe, that segregation and slavery and rape and betrayal are not just wrong in some places at some times, but they are wrong forever and in all places. And when we lose that moral order, we lose the foundation for trust. Trust is my faith that you will do what you ought to do. And we have to have a shared conviction of what that ought is. Trust is built on a sense of shared norms, that we know how to treat each other fairly. If we're merging lanes in a highway, the right lane goes and then the left lane, the right lane, then the left lane. And if you butt in line, I'm going to honk at you to enforce the norms. But if we don't have a shared moral order, life begins to feel fragile and unsteady. And so what we've lost over the last 30 years is a lot of those secure bases have gone away. The family lives are more unstable than they were. Our organized religion has gone away for many Americans. Community life, civic participation has been dropping for 30 years. And we have most fatefully privatized morality. We've told generations of young people, find your own truth, find your own morals, find your own values. If your name is Aristotle, maybe you can do that. Most of us can't do that. We need some sense of the inherited moral faith of our grandmothers and grandfathers. Way back in 1955, Walter Lippmann, a great columnist, wrote a book called The Public Philosophy. And he wrote way back then, if what is right and wrong is up to each individual to decide based on their feelings, we are outside the bounds of civilization. And I think he was basically right about that. And so in all sorts of ways, we've violated that shared order. And when you do that, people feel existentially unsure. And as the philosopher Hannah Arendt once said, existential anxiety always leads to fanaticism of one sort or another. People need that surety, and that's what we're losing. I'm going to read a passage you may recognize that I think describes a bit of the undercurrent of American life, both socially, relationally, spiritually, and morally. All fixed, fast-frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And if you had the kind of education I had, you know that comes from the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. But it gets at something, the existential anxiety. And on top of this, the pain of this lack of a secure base is not evenly distributed. It goes by education. We've created a caste society in this country where people with high school degrees die 10 to 15 years sooner than people with college degrees. People with high school degrees obviously make $1 million less over the course of their lifetime than people with college degrees. People with high school degrees are 5 times more likely to have kids out of wedlock than people with college degrees. People with high school degrees are 5 times more likely to die of opioid addiction than people with college degrees. People with high school degrees are 2.4 times more likely to say they have no friends. They're less likely to go to parks, to go to zoos, to be involved in hobby activities. We've created a caste system based on education. And it's people with less education who are bearing the brunt of the spiritual and moral and relational crisis. And so how do we recover? This was billed as a hopeful, uplifting message. So thank you very much. How do we recover? Something so deep. In my view, we already are. When I often ask people, what experience made you who you are? And nobody ever says to me, I had a great vacation in Hawaii. That was fantastic. That made me the person I am today. Nobody ever says that to me. What they do is they talk about a moment of hardship, a moment of suffering. They talk about a moment of rupture and repair when they went through something hard and they built back. And that's true of people and it's true of nations. I went through a period of rupture and repair about 12 years ago. I had going through a divorce. My kids were leaving home, heading out to California of all places, so I would never see them again. And I realized that I had misled a large part of my life. I had work friends who I could have lunch with and talk politics, but I didn't really have weekend friends. The people you just want to hang out with. I have a friend and she says, we love our friends to be lingerable. And I was not lingerable because I had an efficiency clock going on in my head. And so I was in a bit of emotional pain. I was in pain. And I did what any middle-aged idiot would do, which I tried to work my way through it. Workaholism, too, is a very seductive form of failed social therapy. And if you'd gone to my crappy little apartment in Washington, D.C. in those years, I wasn't having anybody over, because that would have involved cooking. And so if you'd gone to the kitchen and pulled out the drawer where there should have been silverware, there were Post-it notes. And where there should have been plates, there was stationery. And that, to me, was a symbol of an overly workaholic life. And so I ran across a theologian named Henry Nouwen who wrote, when you're in the pain, you have to stay in the pain to see what it has to teach you. And I was like, screw that, I want to get out of the pain. But I ran across another theologian named Paul Tillich who wrote in the 50s and 60s. He would say, our moments of suffering interrupt our lives and remind us we're not the people we thought we were. They carve into what you thought was the basement of your soul, and they carve through that floor and they reveal a cavity below, and then they carve through the floor below and reveal another cavity below. In those moments of suffering, you see deeper into yourself than at any other time. And in moments of national suffering, we come to understand ourselves a little better. Then I ran across another book by a guy named Fred Buechner, a novelist. And he said those moments of suffering can either break you or break you open. And to be broken is to harden up. To be broken open is to grow more vulnerable. And I decided that even in the pain, I was going to try to grow more vulnerable. And I had a lucky break. I got invited over to a couple's house. They were named Kathy and David, and they had a friend in the DC public schools who had a friend named James, whose mom had some drug issues, didn't always able to feed him. And so they said, well, James can stay with us when he needs to. And that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. And by the time I went over to their house on a Thursday night in 2014, there were 40 kids around the dinner table and 15 mattresses around the house. And I walked in there, reached out to shake a kid's hands, and he said, yeah, we're not really allowed to shake hands here. We just hug here. I am not the huggiest human being on the face of this earth. And I went back to that home every Thursday night for 7 years. And we celebrated Thanksgiving together. We celebrated all our holidays together. We took vacations together. And those kids were emotionally open. They beamed love at you, and you had to beam it back. And I learned that when you're in a valley, somebody has to reach in and grab you out. And that, I think, led to a bit of a different life for me. My wife looks at the videos of me. We've been married eight years now, of me before 2010. And she says, well, I wouldn't have married that guy. And so that's America, that's growth, not only economic growth, but spiritual growth. And when I look at countries who have gone through a national period of rupture and repair, and if any of you are in a marriage, you know marriage is built on rupture and repair. Countries go through this, and countries come out of it. I read a book in 2020 called The Promise of Disharmony by a great political scientist named Samuel Huntington. And he writes, I don't know if I believe in cycles of history, but he writes about every 60 years, America seems to go through what he calls a moral convulsion. People get disgusted with established power. They want to burn the system down. Marginalized groups demand inclusion. A young generation comes on the scene. And these periods are brutal to go through because it's periods of incredible transition. And he says it happened in the 1770s with the revolutionary generation. It happened in the 1830s with Andrew Jackson. It happened in the 1890s in the period of industrialization. It happened in the 1960s with riots and assassinations and bombings. People forget in 1969, there were 4,000 bombings on American college campuses. It was a brutal time to live through. And so writing in 1981, he writes, I don't know if I believe in these patterns of history, but if they occur, then sometime around 2020, America will go through another moral convulsion. And I was like, well done, Professor Huntington. And so the good news is we come out of them. In the 1830s was a period kind of like ours. Andrew Jackson was the president most like Donald Trump. He was a bit of a narcissist. He was a populist. He believed in shredding the Constitution, at least his opponents claimed that. He screwed up in a big way. In order to destroy the East Coast elite, he also destroyed the Second Bank of the United States, which is an early version of the Federal Reserve System. He created the second longest depression in American history, and it pivoted the political momentum that he rode on. So you got to wait for the populists to screw up. In my view, the tariffs are that screw up. But second, and I'd point to the 1890s. 1880s and 1890s were a brutal period. Economic turmoil, massive political corruption, massive poverty in America's cities, massive distrust. It turned around in 3 phases. First, a cultural revolution. From the era of social Darwinism, which was sharp elbows, competition, the poor deserve to be poor because they're lazy, we had a cultural ethos called the social gospel movement, which was about community, which is about relationship. It shifted the public culture. That cultural shift led to a civic renaissance. In the 1890s, in just a few years, we had the rise of the Boys and Girls Clubs, the Boys and Girls Scouts, the Sierra Club, the Union Movement, the Settlement House Movement, Jane Addams, the NAACP. All sorts of civic organizations rose up and said, we're going to get active on our country's politics. And then you had a political shift in 1900 called the Progressive Movement, which cleaned up government, gave us the Food and Drug Administration, gave us the Federal Reserve. We came back. We've done it over and over and over again. And so to me, when I think of today, I think of a cultural shift, which this festival embodies, about empathy, about relationship, about community, about the arts, about going on a panel discussion with Anne Hathaway. That's a psychological shift that fills you with hope and secure base. Then a civic renaissance, creation of organizations, some of whom I met. This is happening everywhere in the country. People are just getting active. The political shift will happen later. And so the 2 practical things I'll leave you with is just the ability, the micro of all secure bases, the micro, is great conversations, is getting really good at conversation. And I wrote a book about how to be better at conversation so I could teach myself. And there are things like, don't be a topper. If you say to me, I was on a horrible flight, we were on the tarmac for 2 hours, I'm liable to say to you, yeah, I had a horrible flight, I know what you went through. We were on the tarmac for 6 hours. And it seems like I'm trying to relate to you, but really what I'm saying is, let's pay less attention to your inferior set of experiences and more to my superior set. Second, the quality of your conversations depend on the quality of your questions. Are you good at asking big questions to people? We underestimate how much people want to talk and how much they want to tell about their lives. You are all former great question askers. You are all formerly 3. I have a friend named Naomi Way who teaches 8th grade boys how to be journalists. And the first day she taught this, she got in front of the classroom and said, ask me anything, I'll tell you honestly your answer. And they said, are you married? And she said, no. Second boy said, are you divorced? She said, yes. The third boy said, do you still love him? She was like, whoa. She started crying and said, yes. The next boy asked, does he know you still love him? The next boy asked, do the kids know you still love him? Boom, boom, boom. Ask those questions. And then the final thing I'll end with is just an attitude. Sometime after October 7th, I was in a hotel bar. And you would have looked at me and said, sad guy drinking alone. I call it reporting. And I was on my phone scrolling through Twitter, and it was after October 7th. And the images on my phone were brutal. And I'm just scrolling through them. I came across a different kind of image. It was a little 1-minute video of an interview with James Baldwin, the novelist. And Baldwin says, you know, there's not as much humanity as one would like, but there's more than you would think. There's enough. And then he says, you've got to remember, when you walk down the street, every person you see, that could be you. You could be that person, and that person could be you. And you've got to decide for yourself whether you want to be that wonderful person, that rotten person, that person could be you. Now, James Baldwin had every right to be bitter and scarred because this country treated him awfully because of his race and other things. And yet here he was, making the ultimate humanistic statement. You could be that person. Every person you see, that could be you. And the phrase that leapt to mind as I was looking at that video was the phrase, defiant humanism, that even in harsh and brutal times, it's possible to insist on that fundamental human connection that could be you. And I think that's what we're called upon to do these days. Thanks very much.